Hello. Hello, YouTube. We're going to be picking up on page 262, which is the beginning of the Paralipomena. And we'll be going to page 277. We'll see. Maybe it'll be different. I'll be able to read more quickly. Who knows? Aesthetics presents philosophy with the bill for the fact that the academic system degraded it to being a mere specialization. It demands of philosophy precisely what philosophy has neglected to do, that it extract phenomena from their existence and bring them to self-reflection. This would be the reflection of what is petrified in the sciences, not a specialized science located beyond them. Aesthetics thereby yields to what its object, like any object, immediately seeks. Every artwork, if it is to be fully experienced, requires thought and therefore stands in need of philosophy, which is nothing but the thought that refuses all restrictions. Understanding and criticism are one. The capacity of understanding, that of comprehending what is understood as something spiritual, is none other than that of distinguishing in the object what is true and false, however much this distinction must deviate from the procedure of ordinary logic. Emphatically, art is knowledge, though not the knowledge of objects. Only he understands an artwork who grasps it as a complete nexus of truth, which inevitably involves its relations to untruth, its own as well as that external to it. Any other judgment of artworks would remain arbitrary. Artworks thus demand an adequate relation to themselves. They postulate what was once the aim of the philosophy of art, which, in its present form, it no longer accomplishes, neither vis-a-vis contemporary consciousness nor vis-a-vis current artworks. The idea of a value-free aesthetics is nonsense. To understand artworks, as Brecht incidentally well knew, means to become aware of their logicality and its opposite, and of their fissures and their significance. No one can understand Wagner's Meistersinger who fails to perceive that element denounced by Nietzsche of a narcissistically self-staging positivity, that is, its element of untruth. The diremption of understanding and value is a scientific institution. Without values, nothing is understood aesthetically, and vice versa. In art, more than in any other sphere, it is right to speak of value. Like a mime, every work says, "I'm good, no?" To which what corresponds is a comportment that knows no value. While the effort of aesthetics today presupposes the critique of its universal principles and norms as binding, this effort is itself necessarily restricted to the medium of universal thought. It is not within the purview of aesthetics to abolish this contradiction. Aesthetics must acknowledge the contradiction and reflect it, obedient to the theoretical need that art categorically registers in the age of its reflection. The necessity, however, of such universality in no way legitimates a positive doctrine of aesthetic invariance. In the obligatorily universal determinations, historical processes have sedimented what, to vary an Aristotelian formula, art was. The universal determinations of art are what art developed into. The historical situation of art, which has lost any sense of art's very raison d'être, turned to the past in the hope of finding the concept of art, which retrospectively acquires a sort of unity. This unity is not abstract, but is, rather, the unfolding of art according to its own concept. At every point, therefore, the theory of art presupposes concrete analyses, not as proofs and examples, but as its own condition. Benjamin, who philosophically potentiated to the extreme the immersion in concrete artworks, was himself motivated toward a turn to universal reflection in his theory of reproduction. The requirement that aesthetics be the reflection of artistic experience without relinquishing its resolutely theoretical character can best be fulfilled by incorporating the movement of the concept into the traditional categories and confronting them with artistic experience. At the same time, no continuum between the poles is to be construed. The medium of theory is abstract, and this is not to be masked by the use of illustrative examples. And yet, a spark may occasionally flash up, as it did in Hegel's Phenomenology of Spirit, between the concretion of spiritual experience and the medium of the universal concept. This can occur in such a fashion that the concrete is not merely an illustration, but rather the thing itself, around which abstract reasoning turns, yet without which the name is not to be found. To this end, aesthetics must take its orientation from the process of production, which encompasses the objective problems and desiderata presented by the products themselves. The primacy of the sphere of production in artworks is the primacy of their nature as products of social labor, the contrast with the contingency of their subjective origins. The relation to the traditional categories, however, is unavoidable because only the reflection of these categories makes it possible to open theory to artistic experience. In the transformation of the categories, which such reflection expresses and effects, historical experience penetrates theory. Through the historical dialectic, which thought liberates in the traditional categories, these categories lose their spurious abstractness without sacrificing the universal that inheres in thought. Aesthetics aims at concrete universality. The most ingenious analyses of individual works are not necessarily aesthetics. This is their inadequacy as well as their superiority over what is called the science of art. Recourse to the traditional categories is legitimated by actual artistic experience, for these categories do not simply vanish from contemporary works but return in their negation. Experience culminates in aesthetics. It makes coherent and conscious what transpires in artworks obscurely and unelucidated, and what insufficiently transpires in the particular artwork. In this regard, even a non-idealistic aesthetics is concerned with ideas. The qualitative difference between art and science does not simply consist in using the latter as an instrument for knowing the former. The categories employed by science stand in so obtuse a relation to the inner artistic categories that their direct projection onto the extra-aesthetic categories inevitably wipes out what the investigation was supposed to explain. The growing relevance of technology in artworks must not become a motive for subordinating them to that type of reason that produced technology and finds its continuation in it. What survives of the classical is the idea of artworks as something objective, mediated by subjectivity. Otherwise, art would in fact be an arbitrary, insignificant, and perhaps historically outdated amusement. It would be reduced to the level of an ersatz produced by a society whose energy is no longer consumed by the acquisition of means of subsistence and in which, nevertheless, direct instinctual satisfaction is limited. Art opposes this as the tenacious protest against a positivism that would prefer to subordinate it to a universal heteronomy. Not that art, drawn to the social web of delusion, could not actually be what it opposes, yet its existence is incompatible with the forces that want to humble and subsume it. What speaks out of important artworks is opposed to subjective reason's claim to totality. Its untruth becomes manifest in the objectivity of artworks. Cut loose from its imminent claim to objectivity, art would be nothing but a more or less organized system of stimuli conditioning reflexes that art would autistically and dogmatically attribute to that system rather than to those on which it has an effect. The result would be the negation of the difference between artworks and merely sensual qualities. It would be an empirical entity, nothing more than, in American argot, a battery of tests. The adequate means for giving an account of art would be program analysis or surveys of average group reactions to artworks or genres, except that, perhaps out of respect for recognized branches of culture, positivism seems seldom to go to the extremes logically implied by its own method. If, as a theory of knowledge, it contests all objective meaning and classes as art every thought that is irreducible to protocol sentences, it elimini, though without admitting it, negates art, which is which it takes no more seriously than does the tired businessman who uses it as a massage. If art corresponded with positivistic criteria, positivism would be art's transcendental subject. The concept of art toward which positivism tends converges with that of the culture industry, which indeed formulates its products as those of a system of stimuli, which is what the subjective theory of projection considers art to be. Hegel's argument against a subjective aesthetics based on the sensibility of recipients took issue with its arbitrariness. But this was not the end of it. The culture industry, using statistical averages, calculates the subjective element of reaction and establishes it as a universal law. It has become objective spirit. This, however, in no way weakens Hegel's critique, for the universality of contemporary style is the negative immediacy, the liquidation of every claim to truth raised by the work as well as the permanent deception of the recipients by the implicit assurance that it is for their own good that the money with which they are furnished by the concentrated economic power is once again taken away from them. This all the more directs aesthetics, and sociology as well, insofar as it forms a subsidiary function for subjective aesthetics as a sociology of putative communication, to the objectivity of the artwork. In their actual research, positivistically minded scientists working, for instance, with the Murray test, oppose any analysis of the objective expressive content of the test images, which they consider excessively dependent on the observer and thus scientifically unacceptable. Ultimately, they would need to proceed in this manner with artworks that are not, as in that test, aimed at the recipients, but rather confront those recipients with the artwork's objectivity. As with any apologetic for art, positivism would have an easy time with the bare asseveration that artworks are no sum of stimuli, dismissing artworks as rationalization and projection, good for winning social status, modeled on the relation that millions of cultural Philistines have to art. Or more radically, positivism could disqualify the objectivity of art as a vestige of animism that, like any other vestige, is obliged to give way to enlightenment. Whoever refuses to be swindled out of the experience of objectivity or refuses to cede authority over art to the art alien must proceed imminently, must join with subjective forms of reaction, of which art and its content are, in positivist human understanding, mere reflections. What is true in positivism is the platitude that without the experience of art, nothing can be known about it, and there can be no discussion of it. But precisely this experience contains the distinction that positivism ignores. To put it drastically, this is whether one uses a hit song in which there is nothing to understand as a backdrop for all kinds of psychological projections, or whether one understands a work by submitting to the work's own discipline. What philosophical aesthetics held to be liberating in art, in philosophical argot, which transcended time and space, was the self-negation of this contemplator who is virtually extinguished in the work. This extinguishing is exacted by the artworks and is the index veri e falsi. Only he who submits to its objective criterion understands it, he who is unconcerned about it as a consumer. The subjective element is nevertheless maintained in an adequate relation to art. The greater the effort to participate in the realization of the work and its structural dynamics, the more contemplation the subject invests in the work, the more successfully does the subject, forgetting itself, become aware of the work's objectivity. Even in the work's reception, subjectivity mediates objectivity. Not just in the sublime, as Kant thought, but in all beauty, the subject becomes conscious of its own nullity and attains beyond it to what is other. Kant's doctrine of the sublime falls short only in that it established the counterpart to this nullity as a positive infinity and situates it in the intelligible subject. Pain in the face of beauty is the longing for what the subjective block closes off to the subject, of which the subject nevertheless knows that it is truer than itself. Experience, which would without violence be free of the block, results from the surrender of the subject to the aesthetic law of form. The viewer enters into a contract with the artwork so that it will speak. Those who brag of having got something from an artwork transfer it in Philistine fashion the relation of possession to what is strictly foreign to it. They extend the comportment of unbroken self-preservation, subordinating beauty to that interest that beauty, according to Kant's ever-valid insight, transcends. That there would nevertheless be no beauty without the subject, that beauty becomes what is in itself only by way of its for other, is the fault of the self-positing of the subject. Because this self-positing disrupted beauty, it has need of its recollection by the subject in the image. The melancholy of evening is not the mood of he who feels it, yet it grips only him who has himself been so differentiated, has so much become subject that he is not blind to it. Only the strong and developed subject, the product of all control over nature and its injustice, has the power both to step back from the object and to revoke its self-positing. The subject of aesthetic subjectivism, however, is weak, outer-directed. The overestimation of the subjective element in the artwork and the lack of relation to the artwork are equivalent. The subject only becomes the essence of the artwork when it confronts it foreignly, externally, and compensates for the foreignness by substituting itself for the work. Of course, the objectivity of the artwork is not completely and adequately open to knowledge, and in the works it is never beyond question. The difference between what is demanded by the problem posed by the works and the solution to this demand gnaws away at their objectivity. This objectivity is not a positive fact, but rather an ideal toward which the work and knowledge of it tend. Aesthetic objectivity is not unmediated. He who thinks he holds it in the palm of his hand is led astray by it. If it were unmediated, it would coincide with the sensuous phenomena of art and would suppress its spiritual element, which is, however, fallible both for itself and for others. Aesthetics effectively means the study of the conditions and mediations of the objectivity of art. Hegel's argumentation against Kant's subjectivistic grounding of aesthetics is too facile, in that the object is a priori spirit. The Hegelian immersion in this object or in its categories, which in Hegel still coincide with the genres, transpires without meeting any resistance. The collapse of the absoluteness of spirit brings down with it the absoluteness of artworks. This is why it is so difficult for aesthetics not to capitulate to positivism and perish in it. That the dismemberment of the metaphysics of spirit does not expel spirit. Its spiritual element is strengthened and concretized once it is recognized that not everything in it must be spirit, which, incidentally, Hegel himself did not hold. If the metaphysics of spirit was patterned on art, after the collapse of metaphysics, the spirit of art is, so to speak, restituted. The inadequate subjective positivistic theorems of art must be demonstrated in art itself, not deduced from a philosophy of spirit. Aesthetic norms that are said to correspond to the perceiving subject's invariant forms of reaction are empirically invalid. Thus, the academic psychology is false that, in opposing new music, propounds that the ear is unable to perceive highly complex tonal phenomena that deviate too far from the natural overtone relations. There is no disputing that there are individuals who have this capacity, and there is no reason why everyone should not be able to have it. The limitations are not transcendental but social, those of second nature. If an empirically oriented aesthetics uses quantitative averages as norms, it unconsciously sides with social conformity. What such an aesthetics classifies as pleasing or painful is never a sensual given of nature, but something preformed by society as a whole, by what it sanctions and censors, and this has always been challenged by artistic production. Subjective reactions such as disgust for the suave, motive force in new art, are elements of resistance to the heteronymous social order that have migrated into the sensorium. In general, the supposed basis of art is predicated on subjective forms of reaction and comportments. Even the apparent accidents of taste are governed by a latent compulsion, albeit not always that of the material itself. Any subjective form of reaction that is indifferent to the work is extra aesthetic. At the very least, however, every subjective element in artworks is also motivated by the material itself. The sensibility of the artist is essentially the capacity to hear what is transpiring within the material, to see what the works with the work's own eyes. The more strictly aesthetics, in accord with Hegel's postulate, is constructed on the movement of the material itself, the more objective it becomes and the less it confuses subjectively founded, dubious invariance with objectivity. It was Croce's achievement to have dialectically done away with every standard external to the work. Hegel's classicism prevented him from doing the same. In his aesthetics, he broke off the dialectic just as he did in the political thought of the philosophy of right. Only on the basis of the experience of radically nominalistic new art is Hegel's aesthetics to be fully realized. Here even Croce hesitated. Aesthetic positivism, which replaced the theoretical decipherment of artworks by taking inventories of their effects, can claim to be true only insofar as it denounces that fetishization of artworks that is itself part and parcel of the culture industry and aesthetic decline. Positivism draws attention to the dialectical element that no artwork is ever pure. For many aesthetic forms, such as opera, the effect was constitutive. If the internal movement of the genre compels it to renounce the primacy of effect, then the genre itself becomes impossible. Whoever naively takes the artwork for the pure in itself, as which all the same it must be taken, becomes the naive victim of the work as self-posited and takes semblance for a higher reality, blind to the constitutive element in art. Positivism is the bad consciousness of art. It reminds art that it is not unmediatedly true. Whereas the thesis of the projective character of art ignores its objectivity, its quality and truth content, and is unable to conceive an emphatic concept of art, it is important as the expression of a historical tendency. What in Philistine fashion it inflicts on artworks corresponds to the positivistic caricature of enlightenment, of unfettered subjective reason. Reason's social superiority penetrates the works. This tendency, which would like to render artworks impossible through their de-aestheticization, cannot be arrested by insisting that art must exist. Nowhere is that chiseled in stone. The theory of art as a subjective projection ultimately terminates in the negation of art, and this must be kept in mind if the theory of projection itself is not to be ignominiously neutralized according to the model of the culture industry. But positivistic consciousness has, as false consciousness, its own difficulties. It needs art as an arena in which it may dispose of what does not have any place in its own suffocatingly narrow space. Moreover, positivism, ever credulously devoted to the factually given, is obliged somehow to come to terms with art simply because it exists. The positivists try to rescue themselves from this dilemma by taking art no more seriously than does a tired businessman. This allows them to be tolerant toward artworks which, according to the positivist's own thought, no longer exist. Just how little artworks are subsumed in their genesis, and how much, for this reason, philological methods do them an injustice, can be graphically demonstrated. Schikaneder had no need to dream of Bachofen. The libretto of the magic flute amalgamates the most disparate sources without unifying them. Objectively, however, the work reveals the conflict between matriarchy and patriarchy, between lunar and solar principles. This explains the resilience of the text, long defamed as worse than mediocre by pedants. The libretto occupies a boundary line between banality and profundity, but is protected from the former because the coloratura role of the Queen of the Night is not presented as an evil force. Aesthetic experience crystallizes in the individual work. Still, no particular aesthetic experience occurs in isolation, independently of the continuity of experiencing consciousness. The temporally sequestered and atomistic is as contrary to aesthetic experience as it is to all aesthetic experience. In relation to artworks as monads, the pent-up force of aesthetic consciousness constituted beyond the individual work must participate. It is in this sense that understanding art is meaningful. The continuity of aesthetic experience is colored by all other experience and by all knowledge, though, of course, it is only confirmed and corrected in the actual confrontation with the phenomenon. To intellectual reflection, to taste that considers itself able to judge the matter from above, Stravinsky's Renard may well seem a more suitable treatment of Wedekin's Lulu than does Berg's music. The musician knows, however, how far superior Berg's work is to Stravinsky's, and in its favor it willingly sacrifices the sovereignty of the aesthetic standpoint. Artistic experience is born out of just such conflicts. The feelings provoked by artworks are real and to this extent extra-aesthetic. By contrast to these feelings, a cognitive posture that runs counter to the observing subject is more applicable, more just to the aesthetic phenomenon, without confusing it just as the empirical existence of the observing subject. In that, however, the artwork is not only aesthetic but sub- and supra-aesthetic, in that it originates in empirical layers of life, has the quality of being a thing, a fait social, and ultimately converges with the meta-aesthetic in the idea of truth. It implies a critique of any chemically pure attitude to art. The experiencing subject, from which aesthetic experience distances itself, returns in aesthetic experience as a trans-aesthetic subject. The aesthetic shudder once again cancels the distance held by the subject. Although artworks offer themselves to observation, they at the same time disorient the observer, who is held at the distance of a mere spectator. To him is revealed the truth of the work as if it must also be his own. The instant of this transition is art's highest. It rescues subjectivity, even subjective aesthetics, by the negation of subjectivity. The subject, convulsed by art, has real experiences. By the strength of insight into the artwork as artwork, these experiences are those in which the subject's petrification in his own subjectivity dissolves and the narrowness of his self-positiveness is revealed. If in artworks the subject finds his true happiness in the moment of being convulsed, this is a happiness that is counterposed to the subject, and thus its instrument is tears, which also express the grief over one's own mortality. Kant sensed something of this in his Aesthetic of the Sublime, which he excluded from art. An absence of naivete, a reflective posture toward art clearly also requires naivete, insofar as aesthetic consciousness does not allow its experiences to be regulated by what is culturally approved, but rather preserves the force of spontaneous reaction toward even the most avant-garde movements. However much individual and even artistic consciousness is mediated by society, by the prevailing objective spirit, it remains the geometric site of that spirit's self-reflection and broadens it. Naivete toward art is a source of blindness, but whoever lacks it totally is truly narrow-minded and trapped in what is foisted upon him. The isms must be defended as watchwords, as witnesses to the universal state of reflection, and, insofar as they function in the formation of movements, as the successors of what tradition once performed. This arouses the rage of the dichotomous bourgeois mind. Although it insists on planning and willing everything, under its control art is supposed to be, like love, spontaneous, involuntary, and unconscious. Historical-philosophically, this is denied it. The taboo on watchwords is reactionary. The concept of the new has inherited what once the individualistic concept of originality wanted to express, and which in the meantime is opposed by those who do not want the new, who denounce it as unoriginal and all advanced forms as indistinguishable. If recent art movements have made montage their principle, subcutaneously all artworks have always shared something of this principle. This could be demonstrated in detail in the puzzle technique of the great music of Viennese classicism, which nevertheless corresponds perfectly with the idea of organic development in that era's philosophy. The distortion of the structure of history by the parti pris for real or putatively great events also affects the history of art. Indeed, history always crystallizes in the qualitatively new, but the antithesis must always be held in mind that the sudden appearance of a new quality, the dialectical reversal, is virtually a nonentity. This enervates the myth of artistic creativity. The artist carries out a minimal transition, not the maximal creatio ex nihilo. The differential of the new is the locus of productivity. It is the infinitesimally small that is decisive and shows the individual artist to be the executor of a collective objectivity of spirit in contrast to which his own part vanishes. This was implicitly recognized in the idea of genius as receptive and passive, which opens a view to that in artworks that makes them more than their primary definition, more than artifacts. Their desire to be thus and not otherwise functions in opposition to the character of an artifact by driving it to its extreme. The sovereign artist would like to annul the hubris of creativity. Herein lies the morsel of truth to be found in the belief that everything is always possible. The keys of each and every piano hold the whole appassionata. The composer need only draw it out, but this obviously required Beethoven. In spite of the aversion to what in modernism is regarded as antiquated, the situation of art vis-à-vis Jugendstil has in no way changed as radically as that aversion would like to suppose. This could explain both the aversion to Jugendstil and the undiminished actuality of Schoenberg's Pierrot, as well as of many works by Maeterlinck and Strindberg, which, though they are not identical with Jugendstil, can nevertheless be attributed to it. Jugendstil was the most collective effort to extract from art an otherwise absent meaning. The collapse of this effort paradigmatically circumscribes the contemporary aporia of art. This effort exploded in Expressionism. Functionalism and its counterparts in non-applied arts were its abstract negation. The key to contemporary anti-art, with Beckett at its pinnacle, is perhaps the idea of concretizing this negation, of culling aesthetic meaning from the radical negation of metaphysical meaning. The aesthetic principle of form is in itself, through the synthesis of what is formed, the positing of meaning even when remaining substantively rejected, is substantively rejected. To this extent, whatever it wills or states, art remains theology. Its claim to truth and its affinity to untruth are one and the same. This emerged specifically in Jugendstil. This situation culminates in the question of whether, after the fall of theology and in its total absence, art is still possible. But if, as in Hegel, who was the first to express historico-philosophical doubts as to this possibility, this necessity subsists, art retains an oracular quality. It is ambiguous whether the possibility of art is a genuine witness to what endures of theology, or if it is the reflection of an enduring spell. As is evident in its name, Jugendstil is a declaration of permanent puberty. It is a utopia that barters off its own unrealizability. Hatred of the new originates in a concealed tenet of bourgeois ontology, that the transient should be transient, that death should have the last word. The idea of making a sensation was always bound up with the effort to épater le bourgeois, and was adapted to the bourgeois interest of turning everything to a profit. However certain it is that the concept of the new is shot through with pernicious social characteristics, especially with that of nouveauté, on the market it is equally impossible, ever since Baudelaire, Manet, and Tristan, to dispense with it. Efforts to do away with it, faced with its putative contingency and arbitrariness, have only heightened both. Ever and again, the menacing category of the new radiates the allure of freedom more compellingly than it radiates its inhibiting, leveling, sometimes sterile aspects. The category of the new, as the abstract negation of the category of the permanent, converges with permanence. The invariance of the new is its weakness. Modernism emerged as something qualitatively new, in opposition to exhausted given forms. For this reason, it is not purely temporal. This helps to explain why, on the one hand, it acquired those invariable features for which its critics gladly indict it, and why, on the other hand, the new cannot simply be dismissed as being obsolete. In it, the inner aesthetic and the social interlock. The more art is compelled to oppose the standardized life stamped out by the structure of domination, the more it evokes chaos. Chaos forgotten becomes disaster. This explains the mendacity of the clamor about the putative, spiritual terror of modern art, clamor that surpasses that terror of the world to which art stands opposed. The terror of a form of reaction that puts up with nothing but the new is salutary for the shame it casts on the banality of official culture. Those who embarrass themselves by blathering that art must not forget humanity, or when, in the face of bewildering works, they ask what the message is, will be reluctantly compelled, perhaps even without genuine conviction, to sacrifice cherished habits. Shame can, however, inaugurate a process in which the external pervades the inner, a process that makes it impossible for the terrorized to go on bleeding with the others. It is impossible to consider the emphatic aesthetic idea of the new apart from the industrial procedures that increasingly dominate the material production of society. Whether they are mediated by the exhibition of works, as Benjamin seems to have assumed, remains to be decided. Industrial techniques, however, the repetition of identical rhythms and the repetitive manufacture of an identical object based on a pattern, at the same time contain a principle antithetical to the new. This exerts itself as a force in the antinomy of the aesthetically new. Just as there is nothing that is simply ugly per se, and just as anything ugly can become beautiful through its function, so there is nothing that is simply beautiful. It is trivial to note that the most beautiful sunset, the most beautiful girl, faithfully painted, can become repellent. And yet the element of immediacy in the beautiful, as in the ugly, is not to be suppressed. No lover capable of perceiving distinctions, and this capacity is the precondition of love, will allow the beauty of the beloved to perish. Beauty and ugliness are neither to be hypostatized nor relativized. Their relation is revealed in stages where one frequently becomes the opposite of the other. Beauty is historical in itself as what wrests itself free. Just how little empirical productive subjectivity and its unity converge with the constitutive aesthetic subject, or, indeed, with objective aesthetic quality, is attested by the beauty of many cities. Perugia and Assisi show the highest degree of form and coherence, probably without its ever having been intended or envisioned, although it is important not to underestimate the degree of planning even in a second nature that seems organic. This impression is favored by the gentle swell of a mountain, the reddish hue of stones, that is, by the extra aesthetic that, as a material of human labor, is itself one of the determinants of form. Here, historical continuity acts as subject, truly an objective spirit that permits itself to be directed by the extra aesthetic without requiring the individual architect to be conscious of it. This historical subject of beauty also largely directs the work of the individual artist. Although the beauty of these cities seems to be the result of strictly external factors, its source is internal. Immanent historicity becomes manifest, and with this manifestation, aesthetic truth unfolds. The identification of art with beauty is inadequate, and not just because it is too formal. In what art became, the category of the beautiful is only one element, one that has moreover undergone fundamental change. By absorbing the ugly, the concept of beauty has been transformed in itself, without, however, aesthetics being able to dispense with it. In the absorption of the ugly, beauty is strong enough to expand itself by its own opposite. Hegel was the first to oppose aesthetic sentimentalism that seeks to discern the inherent content of the artwork, not in the work itself, but rather in its effect. This sentimentalism later became a concern with mood, a concept that has its own historical importance. For better or worse, nothing better defines Hegel's aesthetics than its incompatibility with the element of an artwork's mood. He insists, as he does throughout his philosophy, on the sturdiness of the concept. This redounds to the objectivity of the artwork rather than its effects or to its merely sensuous facade. Progress that Hegel thus achieved was, however, bought at the price of a certain art alienness. The objectivity was bought at the cost of reification and excess of materiality. This progress threatens to set aesthetics back to the pre-artistic, to the concrete comportment of the bourgeois, who wants to be able to find a fixed content in a painting or a play that he can grasp as well as depend on. In Hegel, the dialectic of art is limited to the genres and their history, and it is not sufficiently introduced into the theory of the individual work. That natural beauty rebuffs definition by spirit leads Hegel, in a short circuit, to disparage what in art is not spirit qua intention. The correlative of intention is reification. The correlative of absolute making is always the made as a fixed object. Hegel mistakes what is not thing-like in art, which is inseparable from the concept of art as being opposed to the empirical world of things. Polemically, he attributes what is not thing-like in art to natural beauty as its encumbering indeterminacy. But it is precisely in this element that natural beauty possesses something without which the artwork would revert back into a non-aesthetic facticity. Those who in experiencing nature are unable to distinguish it from objects to be acted upon, the distinction that constitutes the aesthetic, are incapable of artistic experience. Hegel's thesis that art beauty originates in the negation of natural beauty, and thus in natural beauty, needs to be turned around. The act that initially gives rise to the consciousness of something beautiful must be carried out in the immediate experience, if it is not already to postulate what it constitutes. The conception of natural beauty communicates with natural beauty. Both want to restore nature by renouncing its mere immediacy. In this context, Benjamin's concept of aura is important. Quote, the concept of aura proposed above with reference to historical objects may usefully be illustrated with reference to the aura of natural ones. We define the aura of the latter as the unique phenomenon of a distance, however close it may be. While resting on a summer afternoon to let one's gaze follow a mountain range on the horizon or a branch that casts its shadow over one, that is to breathe the aura of those mountains, or of that branch. End quote. Here, what is called aura is known to artistic experience as the atmosphere of the artwork, that whereby the nexus of the artwork's elements points beyond this nexus and allows each individual element to point beyond itself. Precisely this constituent of art, for which the existential ontological term being attuned provides only a distorted equivalent, is what in the artwork escapes its factual reality. What, fleeting and elusive, and this could hardly have been conceived in Hegel's time, can nevertheless be objectivated in the form of artistic technique. The reason why the auratic element does not deserve Hegel's ban is that a more insistent analysis can show that it is an objective determination of the artwork. That aspect of an artwork that points beyond itself is not just a part of its concept but can be recognized in the specific configuration of every artwork. Even when artworks divest themselves of every atmospheric element, a development inaugurated by Baudelaire, is conserved in them as a negated and shunned element. Precisely this auratic element has its model in nature, and the artwork is more deeply related to nature in this element than in any other factual similarity to nature. To perceive the aura in nature in the way Benjamin demands in his illustration of the concept requires recognizing in nature what it is that essentially makes an artwork an artwork. This, however, is that objective meaning that surpasses subjective intention. An artwork opens its eyes under the gaze of the spectator when it emphatically articulates something objective, and this possibility of an objectivity that is not simply projected by the spectator is modeled on the expression of melancholy or serenity that can be found in nature when it is not seen as an object of action. The distancing that Benjamin stresses in the concept of aura as a rudimentary model of the distancing of natural objects as potential means from practical aims. The threshold between artistic and pre-artistic experience is precisely that between the domination of the mechanism of identification and the innervations of the objective language of objects. Just as the exemplary instance of the Philistine is a reader who judges his relation to artworks on the basis of whether he can identify with the protagonists, so false identification with the immediately empirical person is the index of complete obtuseness toward art. This false identification abolishes the distance at the same time that it isolates the consumption of aura as something higher. True, even an authentic relation to the artwork demands an act of identification. The object must be entered and participated in. As Benjamin says, it is necessary, quote, to breathe its aura. But the medium of this relationship is what Hegel called freedom toward the object. The spectator must not project what transpires in himself onto the artwork in order to find himself confirmed, uplifted, and satisfied in it, but must, on the contrary, relinquish himself to the artwork, assimilate himself to it, and fulfill the work in its own terms. In other words, he must submit to the discipline of the work rather than demand that the artwork give him something. The aesthetic comportment, however, that avoids this, thereby remaining blind to what in the artwork is more than factually the case, is unitary with the projective attitude, that of terre à terre, which characterizes the contemporary epoch as a whole and de-aestheticizes artworks. Correlatively, artworks become, on the one hand, things among things, and, on the other, containers for the psychology of the spectator. As mere things, they no longer speak, which makes them adequate as receptacles for the spectator. The concept of mood, so opposed by Hegel's objective aesthetics, is thereby insufficient, because it is precisely mood that reverses what Hegel calls the truth in the artwork under its own opposite by translating it into what is merely subjective, a spectator's mode of reaction, and represents it in the work itself according to the model of this subjectivity. Mood in artworks once meant that in which the effect and the internal constitution of works formed a murky amalgam that went beyond their individual elements. As the semblance of sublimity, mood delivered the artwork over to the empirical. Although one of the limits of Hegel's aesthetics is its blindness to this element of mood, is at the same time its dignity that caused it to avoid the twilight between the aesthetic and the empirical subject. Rather than that, as Kant thought, spirit in the face of nature becomes aware of its own superiority, it becomes aware of its own natural essence. This is the moment when the subject, vis-à-vis the sublime, is moved to tears. Recollection of nature breaks the arrogance of his self-positing. Quote, my tears well up, earth, I am returning to you, end quote. With that, the self exits, spiritually, from its imprisonment in itself. Something of freedom flashes up that philosophy, culpably mistaken, reserves for its opposite, the glorification of the subject. The spell that the subject casts over nature imprisons the subject as well. Freedom awakens in the consciousness of its affinity with nature. Because beauty is not subordinate to natural causality imposed by the subject and phenomena, its realm is that of a possible freedom. No more than in any other social realm is the division of labor in art a plain evil. When art reflects the social coercion in which it is harnessed, and by doing so opens up a perspective on reconciliation, it is spiritualization. This spiritualization, however, presupposes the division of manual and intellectual labor. Only through spiritualization, and not through stubborn rank natural growth, do artworks break through the net of the domination of nature and mold themselves to nature. Only from within does one issue forth. Otherwise, art becomes infantile. Even in spirit, something of the mimetic impulse survives, that secularized manna, what moves and touches us. In many works of the Victorian era, not only in England, the force of sexuality and the sensuality related to it becomes even more palpable through its concealment. This could be shown in many of Theodore Storm's novellas. In early Brahms, whose genius has not been sufficiently appreciated to this day, there are passages of an overwhelming tenderness, such as could be expressed only by one who is deprived of it. Once again, it is a gross simplification to equate expression and subjectivity. What is subjectively expressed does not need to resemble the expressing subject. In many instances, what is expressed will be precisely what the expressing subject is not. Subjectively, all expression is mediated by longing. Sensual satisfaction, punished at various times by an ascetic authoritarianism, has historically become antagonistic to art. Mellifluous sounds, harmonious colors, and suaveness have become kitsch and trademarks of the culture industry. The sensual appeal of art continues to be legitimate only when, as in Berg's Lula or in the work of André Masson, it is the bearer of a function of the content rather than an end in itself. One of the difficulties of new art is how to combine the desideratum of internal coherence, which always imports a certain degree of evident polish into the work, with opposition to the culinary element. Sometimes the work requires the culinary, while paradoxically the sensorium balks at it. By defining art as something spiritual, however, the sensual element is not simply negated. Even this insight, hardly anathema to traditional aesthetics, that aesthetically only what is realized in sensual material counts, is superficial, but has been attributed to the highest artworks as metaphysical power has, over millennia, been fused with an element of sensuous happiness that autonomous formation has always opposed. It is only by grace of that element that art is intermittently able to become an image of bliss. The comforting, motherly hand that strokes one's hair gives sensuous pleasure. Extreme spirituality reverses into the physical. In its parti pris for sensual appearance, traditional aesthetics sensed something that has since been lost, but took it too immediately. Without the harmonious sonority of a string quartet, the D-flat major passage of the slow movement of Beethoven's Op. 59 No. 1 would not have the power of consolation. The promise that the content is real, which makes it truth content, is bound up with the sensual. Here art is as materialistic as is all metaphysical truth. That today this element is proscribed probably involves the true crisis of art. Without recollection of this element, however, there would no longer be art, any more than if art abandoned itself entirely to the sensual. Artworks are things that tend to slough off their rarity. However, in artworks, the aesthetic is not superimposed on the thing in such a fashion that, given a solid foundation, their spirit could emerge. Essential to artworks is that their thingly structure, by virtue of its constitution, makes them into what is not a thing. Their rarity is the medium of their own transcendence. The two are mediated in each other. The spirit of artworks is constituted in their rarity, and their rarity, the existence of works, originates in their spirit. As regards form, artworks are things insofar as the objectivation that they give themselves resembles what is in itself, what rests within itself and determines itself, and this has its model in the empirical world of things. Indeed, by virtue of their unity through the synthesizing spirit, they become spiritualized only through the reification, just as their spiritual element and their reity are melded together. Their spirit, by which they transcend themselves, is at the same time their lethality. This they have implicitly always borne in themselves, and ineluctable reflection has exposed it. Narrow limits are set to the thing character of art, and in temporal arts especially, in spite of the objectivation of their texts, their non-thingly quality survives in the momentariness of their appearance. That a piece of music or a play is written down bears a contradiction that the sensorium recognizes in the frequency with which the speeches of actors on stage ring false because they are obliged to enunciate something as if it were spontaneous, even though it is imposed by the text. But the objectivation of musical scores and dramatic texts cannot be summoned back to improvisation. The crisis of art, which has today reached the point of endangering its very possibility, affects both of its poles equally. On the one hand, its meaning and thereby essentially its spiritual content, and on the other hand, its expression and thereby its mimetic element. One depends on the other. There is no expression without meaning, without the medium of spiritualization, no meaning without the mimetic element, without art's eloquence, which is now in the process of perishing. Aesthetic distance from nature is a movement toward nature. In this, idealism did not deceive itself. The telos of nature, the focal point toward which the force fields of art are organized, compels art towards semblance, the concealment of what in it belongs to the external world of things. Benjamin's dictum that the paradox of an artwork is that it appears is by no means as enigmatic as it may sound. Every artwork is in fact an oxymoron. Its own reality is for it unreal. It is indifferent to what it essentially is, and at the same time it is its own precondition. In the context of reality, it is all the more unreal and chimerical. The enemies of art have always understood this better than those of its apologists, who have fruitlessly sought to deny its own constitutive paradox. Aesthetics is paralysis that seeks to dissolve the constitutive contradiction rather than conceiving of art by way of it. The reality and unreality of artworks are not layers superimposed on each other. Rather, they interpenetrate everything in art to an equal degree. An artwork is real only to the extent that, as an artwork, it is unreal, self-sufficient, and differentiated from the empirical world, of which it nevertheless remains a part. But its unreality, its determination as spirit, only exists to the extent that it has become real. Nothing in an artwork counts that is not there in an individuated form. In aesthetic semblance, the artwork takes up a stance toward reality, which it negates by becoming a reality sui generis. Art protests against reality by its own objectivation. No matter where an interpreter enters his text, he always encounters a boundless profusion of desiderata that he must fulfill, although it is impossible to fulfill any one of them without causing another to suffer. He runs up against the incompatibility of what the works themselves want in their own terms, and what they want of him. The compromises that result, however, are detrimental because of the indifference inherent in indecision. Fully adequate interpretation is a chimera. This is not the least of what grants primacy to the ideal reading over performing. For reading, and in this it is comparable to Locke's infamous universal triangle, tolerates the coexistence of opposites because it is at once sensuous and non-sensuous intuition. This paradox of an artwork becomes apparent in a gathering of devotees around an artist to whom a particular problem or difficulty has been naively pointed out in a work in progress, whereupon he turns to his interlocutor with a condescending, desperate smile and replies, "But that's just the trick." He rebukes one who knows nothing of the constitutive impossibility under which he works. and mourns over the a priori futility of his effort. The fact that he tries to nevertheless is the dignity of all virtuosos despite all the exhibitionism and the straining after effect. Virtuosity should not confine itself to the reproduction of a work, but should, rather, fully enter the facture, which it is compelled to do so by its own sublimation. Virtuosity makes the paradoxical essence of art, the possibility of the impossible, appear. Virtuosos are the martyrs of artworks. In many of their achievements, whether those of ballerinas or coloratura sopranos, something sadistic has become sedimented, some traces of the torture required to carry it out. It is no coincidence that the name artist is borne both by the circus performer and one who has most turned away from effect, who champions the audacious idea of art to fulfill its pure concepts. If the logicality of artworks is also always their enemy, the absurd constitutes the counter-tendency to logicality even in traditional art, long before it became a philosophical program. This is proof that in art absolute logicality is empty. There is no net under authentic artworks that could protect them in their fall. If, in an artwork, a process of development is objectivated and brought to an equilibrium, this objectivation thereby negates the process and reduces it to a mere as-if. This is probably why, in the wake of the contemporary rebellion of art against semblance, the forms of aesthetic objectivation have been rejected, and the attempt was made to replace a merely simulated process of development with an immediate improvisational process of becoming, even though the power of art, its dynamic element, could not exist without such a fixation and thus without its semblance. All right, I'm going to call it for the day. I'll see you next time.